If anybody does final bosses right, it's FromSoft. For years, they've graced us with icon after icon, so this is one of the harder rankings I've had to do. This is a quality ranking considering everything from boss arena, OST, lore, visual appeal, mechanics, voice acting, etc. So buckle up, because we're starting now with every final boss in Soulsborne ranked from worst to best. Number 7, Nashandra. As per my New Year's resolution, it's time to show some kindness to Dark Souls 2. Do I love Nashandra? No. But let's talk about some of the huge positives around the encounter first. I adore the finality that is established in this huge, daunting run-up to the boss arena. It feels like you're entering a tomb of despair, making the title Throne of Want feel at least mildly ironic. I love the eerie music and powerful voice acting with a fitting distorted filter over the voice. The entire stage is set pretty flawlessly as Nashandra glides in. This is one of the times my stomach sank in the entire Souls series, as before this, Nashandra is shown as a beautiful queen. Her visual design is disturbing in the best possible way, and I love the way the camera shakes as if we're seeing all of this horrible stuff from our character's point of view. And he's shaking in fear at being faced with the menace. As for the fight itself, the curse mechanic is utilized pretty well, and none of Nashandra's attacks are offensively bad. The problem is, the fight is just paced so slowly to the point where you can basically just go up and whack on her unpunished for the half of the fight at least. She poses almost no threat, has almost no mobility, and has slower and fewer combos than some of the bosses from the mid-game. While the atmosphere here is definitely on point, the mechanics of the fight is where it falls flat, putting it at an above average boss, but bottom tier for FromSoft's finales. Number 6, False King Allant. The newest addition to my FromSoft belt is Demon Souls, and that includes False King Allant. I was actually blown away by the quality of this one, which I suppose gives away how highly I think of these final bosses, if this is still 6 out of 7. A lot of the Demon Souls bosses leave a little bit to be desired, but they've really hit it out of the park with the last two in particular, in Penetrator and False King Allant. As much as I despise the run-up to the False King in a lot of ways, I will admit that it sets the stage for whatever to be behind this behemoth challenge to be truly worthy of such a fortress. And I'll say he absolutely doesn't disappoint. It almost feels like he sets the gold standard for FromSoft bosses from this point on, as all of the best bosses of the series remind me of the False King in some ways, even down to the specifics of things such as wind slashes. Because I played the original 2009 Demon Souls, I adored the organ-forward soundtrack. Who doesn't love a little organ from time to time? No, not that kind of organ, Hannibal. So like I said, this stage is set perfectly, which is going to essentially be the default for the entire list, fortunately. But False King is aggressive, fast, and full of plenty of tricks, which is very different from a lot of the bosses in Demon Souls. There's massive cancelable AoEs. Thank you, comments section, for letting me know. I mean, I knew that the whole time. I was just testing you guys. He's got wind slashes, arena-wide dashes, varied combos, and the ability to suck levels out of you. And no, that's not a euphemism, I mean it literally. I wouldn't have had a problem with this necessarily, but it really can F you up. I mean, on my first playthrough, I literally had to de-equip all of my armor in the middle of the fight because I began to fat roll, thanks to the level suckage. So it really can be a pain in the booty, but it's impressive how it feels like he's transported out of another Souls game with how built up he is. Oh, and I adore his arena. It's kind of a light version of the Moog boss arena, as it comes complete with stairs, although these ones can actually be used to give yourself a moment of reprieve to heal. As for actual complaints, I suppose I don't love that the run back has to be completed every time you die, because it just makes every death feel agonizingly punishing. That, on top of the level sucking, makes it double punishing. Other than that though, this is pretty much perfect. Number 5, Gwyn, Lord of Cinder. Alright, I'll get this out of the way first. I have a lot more complaints about Gwyn than I do about the False King, but there is an intangible value that Gwyn provides that I just can't deny. I know the nostalgia factor alone catapults Gwyn to first for a lot of you, and I can't necessarily blame you for that, but hey, this is my list, and well, if you don't like it, that's your prerogative. Okay, so the huge positives obviously include the massively intangible sentimentality of Gwynny Boy. This encapsulates the iconic music, although it's still not in my top 10 of the series. If you want to see that video, check it out here. It includes the melancholic reveal of his fall from grace, and the ghostly apparitions that guide your entrance to the kiln. The shadows dancing on the walls from the flickering flame as you clash swords in an ash-filled tomb. I love his aggression, although it is a bit much if you don't parry. and I love his design, one that is simple yet powerful in its visual storytelling. The fight itself though is a bit erratic. With the long Dark Souls 1 heal times and his non-stop onslaught, it can be almost impossible to get a heal in, but then you parry him and he becomes one of the easiest bosses of the entire game. I just wish there was some sort of buff to him against parries. Maybe no parries. Yeah, I like that. I also think there's something to be said about how Gwyn tops off Dark Souls 1's narrative so smoothly. All in all, it just misses out on being in that top of the top tier, but it's still definitely in God tier. Number 4. Radagon and Elden Beast. This one is a bit harder to rank because, well, it's two unique fights. The main question I had in my head was, how does this theme slap so hard? But the second question was, do I include Radagon in the fight? It says final boss, not final bosses, you know what I'm saying, you know what I mean? Of course, it really is one boss in a way because you have to beat both in one try, and they're part of the same experience. I ended up leaving Radagon in here because it really wouldn't have changed the placement if I included him or not, so might as well. We can start with the moment Radagon pulls the hammer up and the theme hits because that is one of the most iconic moments in all of gaming. Gave me chills the first time and it still does to this day. I have some minor complaints about Radagon as a boss, although believe me, I know most of you have plenty more about Elden Beast. As much as I do love Radagon and his fight is spectacular, I find some of the AoEs mildly frustrating to dodge. This is because the way they radiate out of his hammer can make the timing very odd to master. But over time I've grown more and more accustomed to it and would rank him higher than I did in my initial ranking. So the theme slaps, the cutscene slaps, the arena slaps, and the animation slap. But what about the second half? Elden Boof. Well, in my opinion, it's an improvement on just about every front, except for the soundtrack. That's the same because they're both the same song, really. But I do like both halves about equally. Of course, both fights are aiming for a totally different experience. One grounded and powerful, the other astral and enchanting. I prefer the Elden Beast for how much it manages to subvert the final boss trope. If you'll notice, all of these final bosses are very much humanoid, so for the final opponent in Elden Ring to be such a strange, amorphous being is ambitious and greatly appreciated by me. It's one of the best arenas in the series, and there's just about nothing I'd change about these fights. Elden Stars is the mild annoyance in this phase though, and the only attack that I think could use some reworking, although I believe it was tuned from the initial patch already. So for wrapping up such a grand journey with a 1-2 punch of unique and iconic battles that test your endurance over one-shot survivability, these boys get number 4. Yes, above Gwyn. Guys, get over it. Number 3. Oh god, this hurts. Gehrman the First Hunter. So when ranking these bosses, as I said in the intro, I'm considering the soundtrack, the arena, the aesthetics, the atmosphere, the design, the mechanics, the fun, the narrative, blah blah blah. There's so much that goes into it. And Gehrman is an 11 out of 10 in so many of these departments. The only one in which he's an 8 or 9 out of 10 is difficulty because I don't think it was perfectly matched. He's one of the bosses that I can consistently beat on my first try, all the way back from my first playthrough, and that takes down the intensity of the encounter just a smidge, just a tiddlywink. I love feeling like if I mess up, I could face some serious consequences, as in have to try again in 10 seconds. But with Gehrman, it doesn't feel like that, it feels like a bit of a stroll through the field of flowers sometimes. Of course, it's really hard to not get hit by him as he is a really fast and speedy grandpa that just learned how to walk, but he just doesn't hit too hard. He's relatively easy to parry, and because of that, I can kind of just face tank him on most of my playthroughs. Everything outside of that though is an 11 out of 10 as I mentioned. This won my favorite boss arena in Souls, and for good reason. There are so many bangers to pick from, so that is a high honor. It has at least a top 5 cutscene in Gehrman joining the hunt, has a top 10 soundtrack, and so much narrative and emotional significance. Whether you're an avid lore buff or a gameplay only kind of person, you have chilled around Gehrman from the start of the game and become at least somewhat acquainted with him. For this twist reveal to happen, and you end up both battling each other tragically, it's something that just can't be matched even in the other Souls games. I wonder how good you'd have to be to surpass Gehrman in terms of boss quality awesomeness. Probably pretty epic, but not as epic as being a subscriber of the Nightwalk 2 channel. Anyone? Huh? Please. I need help. Number 2, Soul of Cinder. So I think people have covered why Soul of Cinder is perfection ad nauseum by now. He literally is an amalgamation of all the people who have previously linked the fire, raising to protect the flame in one final ditch effort. You're fighting your fellow Souls buddies. What could be more awesome than that? And to top it all off, we have a perfection of the Gwyn fight, complete with a more interesting dynamic theme. It's literally Gwyn 2.0. What else could you want? But what about the other stuff in the fight? Well, the arena is top tier as well, of course, but the entire preceding area matches the killing of the first flame from Dark Souls 1 to me. The way civilizations are just warping on themselves give this land a stronger sense of identity, and it's just so visually striking. To try to provide some unique commentary here, I'll mention how a lot of people say that the difficulty of Soul of Cinder is trivial. That may be true for people who master the game, but in comparison with Gehrman, I think Soul of Cinder is way harder. And if you keep in mind that these games are approached blind by people on a regular basis, that might change your perception. As far as I'm aware, Dark Souls 3 saw an influx of more new players than any of the previous installments before it when it came out, meaning there were tons of new people to the series who just started with Dark Souls 3. And let me tell you, if you do not have an optimized build, this guy can be a problem. I was new to the series, and the constantly shifting playstyle meant I needed to learn, 5 bosses in one? And he had 2 full health bars. It just felt undoable. I played with like the Irithyll of the Boreal Nuthole straight sword icy thing from the beginning to the end of the game, and geez, that thing felt like I was hardly tickling the man. So no, I don't think the difficulty needs any tuning, especially when you look at how much easier the 2 previous games are, like Nashandra for example. That is just a much easier final boss than Soul of Cinder. So yeah, this guy stuck with me for being one of the top challenges of Dark Souls 3, at least for the base game, and a perfect culmination of the entire Souls series. But number 1 is Ishin the Sword Saint. And yes, I still maintain Ishin is the best final boss in Souls, and potentially in any game ever. This boss is so good that it feels like a DLC level boss. What I mean by that is when FromSoft releases a title, they typically release a DLC a year or so afterwards. Please release one for Elden Ring. And in that DLC is found all of the best bosses of the game. This is because the developer had time to listen to community feedback, fine-tune their systems, experiment with different ideas, and access a player who has mastered the game already, so they could just go balls to the walls. This is where you get your Midirs, your Gales, your Orphan of Casas. But somehow it feels like they've packaged a DLC boss as the final boss of Sekiro. Minor thing about FromSoft games is they typically don't have a very smooth difficulty curve. Usually it feels kind of like or but in the case of Sekiro, it's actually a really smooth build-up to the ending in which it goes wah! I love that because it really does feel like the game is just so perfectly curated to give you a hyper-specialized experience. This is something that the open world format of Elden Ring just can't compete with, and it's why boss lists for that game look so wonky to some people. Different builds and access times change the game entirely, where Sekiro is just one perfect package. But anyways, off to Ishin. Of course, the iconic Field of Flowers is back to cap off the real challenge of the game, but I think the undiscussed gem of the fight is Ishin's entrance. It's horrifically bone-cracking and ew. I love it. There's a perfect elevation of difficulty from beginning of the fight to the end, with the first phase being unbelievably hard the first time around, but now becomes the easiest part of the fight. Second phase, obviously the biggest challenge, and the third phase is somewhere in the middle, as you get this lightning to help you out. But the lightning reversal adds the spectacle that I think is lacking from a couple of the Sekiro bosses throughout the game, making Ishin the best final boss in any of the Souls games. So thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know what you think down below, your ranking. I'll see you guys later. Peace.